Last talk of our 10 or 11 part series that kept growing, dedicated to Utopia and Dystopia. And what we've been trying to answer in the series of talks and screenings are a few questions, which I'll read here. So, is the yearning for a lost paradise a human universal? And is it always doomed to failure? In what ways do our attempts to create a paradise on earth backfire? And is there always truly a serpent in the garden? So we're very excited to have you all here tonight. I'll explain a little bit about the night, but first I also just want to thank Hauser Wirth for allowing us to do this crazy programming here. And specifically to Philip Spradley, Jake Brodsky, Paige Landsberg, and Jeremy, tech guy, we don't know your last name, but you've been so great, we really thank you. So thank you, please keep coming back to other events. We'll be doing a new series here, I think Letitia will talk a little bit about, that'll open in September. And so tonight's talk, as you all know, is about necromancy, and it will explore a variety of encounters between the living and the dead, from accidental haunting to deliberate conjuration of the shades of ghosts and everything in between. And Letty's going to tell you about a few more things, and then we will introduce the speakers still.
Thank you, Joanna. Hi. So, hello. I'm not going to keep you long, but so two things. So for those who don't know, we are also ending our season at Greenwood Cemetery this Friday, and we'll be doing a cemetery garden party. So if you don't have your ticket yet, you should buy tickets. And we'll be reopening the library in a new exhibition in September. If you want to know more, you should come to me after, and I'll get your email for the newsletter. And then in other news, John and I have associated ourselves with Mark Pinklington from Strange Attractor Press to do a book about tarot, which, because we have no money, we need your help to fund. So if you want to, it's going to be a great book. We talked to a publisher who allowed us to have a special discount for tonight. So if you want the link, you can just find it on the blog or on the Instagram, on the top link. And the code for the discount for 10% discount is 10 necromancy. And if you want more, I know. And so if you want to know more, you can come to see me later, and I will give you more information. And please welcome. I'm gonna wait for that last person to come, and then introduce just traffic jam. But yeah. And so we're gonna introduce our first speaker, Dr. Alexander Cummins. He's a professional. Yay! Dr. Alexander Cummins is a professional diviner, a trained historian, as well as a consultant sorcerer. He received his doctorate in early modern British magic from the University of Bristol. His work focuses on grimoires, divination, astrological magic, and magical medicine, as well as folk necromancy. Dr. Cummins currently resides in Brooklyn with his amazing wife, who's going to talk later, and their vast expanse of cat. It can be found and booked for readings, talk workshops, and a variety of other events at www.alexandercummins.com. Please welcome Alexander Cummins.
Okay, so first of all, this is my new favourite woodcut, ever. For reasons. So I'd like to imagine, you are imagining along for this little bit of it. I'd like you to imagine that you are standing before a graveyard gate. Might be wrought iron, might be made of twisted yew, stakes just shoved into the ground. Under your arm, you have a hazel wand. Now, if you've been fancy, you will have got some consecrated white linen, and you'll have wrapped it in that, and maybe you'll have got a pen of the art from the third feather of a lapwing's wing, and you'll have drawn particular seals or sigils on it from a book attributed to Solomon that you may have found from someone. And in your bag, you'll have the book of magic that you've drawn from. Glancing around nervously, you hear approaching footsteps. Fearing a witness, whether a sheriff or perhaps the sexton of the graveyard, you squeeze back into the shadows. As the footsteps get closer, you begin to wonder if the feet even belong to someone mortal. Perhaps being spotted is the least of your worries. Finally, a figure turns the corner and you relax a little. It is your friend, your fellow, that you have agreed to do this work this night. They pull out of their bag and indicate a candle and showstone that they were to procure for the operation. The bell begins to toll, you nod to each other and scale the gate. Tonight is the night you summon a ghost. So the book in your bag would probably, in the 17th century, have been Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. And if we pull up the first slide, yeah! There's a particular experiment or operation for the dead. In the marginalia it says, for the conjuring of a dead spirit. And this would have included a series of instructions. So you would have had a hazel wand, for one. What else? You would have abstained from all filthiness for at least 3 days before the operation. You would have let no other person see your doings as you went there, other than your fellow that you agreed to do this with, who would have a candle and a showstone, and you would have a hazel wand. You would use that wand to strike the ground 3 times to wake the dead, amongst other things, and would recite a series of incantations. And in that particular working, there's already some fascinating detail in that you're not just summoning the dead for the sake of summoning the dead, you're summoning a ghost to send to bring you a fairy queen by the name of Sibelia as well. So we're already into the realm of not just the dead, but also a variety of other spirits that you may be talking to via necromancy. So we know that this operation was being used by a variety of peoples because it comes in the form of a Sloane manuscript as well, which is a working book of a magician, a cunning man from London by the awesome name of Arthur Gauntlet, which is already just like brilliant anyway. He copied out this conjuration from Reginald Scott, and he gives a variety of other details about how it's meant to be done. And they coordinate with a bunch of other instructions that we find in a variety of grimoire texts and occult philosophy alike. Especially the idea of letting no one see what you're doing. And secrecy here isn't just a matter of not getting arrested for doing necromancy, which, as far as friends of mine from the Law Society tell me, in the UK is still illegal. And not from the fraudulent medium stuff of having to say for entertainment purposes only, literally like illegal to summon the dead. That's still in the books, apparently. Along with being able to shoot a Welshman on Sundays or something. Even the Law Society, don't know how many laws there actually are. So I want to talk about that book a little more, about where this experiment would have come from, which I think is the next slide. So I love talking about Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's written by Scott in order to show how ridiculous these superstitions, these magical rituals are. Partly it's also that this occurs after the Reformation, and Scott is firmly anti-Catholic, and so he's trying to show that these are ridiculous superstitions and that he is discovering to people how ridiculous they are. By writing them in elaborate detail of exactly the kind of things you are not meant to do. Perhaps naively, he ends up democratizing magic is one of the ways it gets put. This Discovery of Witchcraft becomes a must-have on the shelves of many magical practitioners, of folk magicians, of wise women, and so on. And as you can see, Owen Davies points out that it was a treasure trove of this kind of stuff, right? That you've got charms, talismans for angels, demons, and of course, the dead. Hello! So amongst that, it's also what has even been called the first print grimoire in the English language. And I love this idea, that the very idea of black magic is spread by someone saying, don't do these things, here's exactly how you shouldn't do them. This appeals to me very much. I think there's something wonderful about it. And as David Rankins also said, who edited a recent version of that working book by Arthur Gauntlet, this also made a variety of learned magic available as well. There's also some cracking diagrams of jugglers and stage magicians as well. This is also part of Scott's plan, is to show that all of this stuff is cousining, is con men effectively. And so yes, some great diagrams of how trapdoors can be used to make an audience think that you've cut your own head off, which sadly I did not have time to prepare tonight. but hopefully you can imagine. Yes, right, so it goes through multiple editions as well, that's the other thing. And you can tell that the publishers start to realise who is buying this. It's not people that don't like magic, because by 1665 you'll notice there's an expanded edition with 9 new chapters in book 15. Book 15 is the good stuff, right? And even added is a discourse concerning devils and spirits, which is also huge and a lot less negative, funnily enough. So certainly if you were kicking around the 1670s, this is probably the book you're using to summon the dead. There were some others available as well, and we'll maybe talk about those a little bit. Yeah, so your boy Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa in the 3 books of occult philosophy, very, very important text, if we're not familiar with that, manages to combine Greco-Roman material in a kind of encyclopedic index, while also presenting some of the hot new Renaissance Christianized Kabbalah as well. He says there's a whole bunch of people writing bad books, books of darkness, which include a variety of customers, including St. Cyprian there, and a couple of others. Robert, an Englishman. Thomas is Thomas Aquinas. So these are also people who are having texts attributed to them. And if we're interested in the panel, maybe we can talk about a particular process that Richard Kierkegaard calls inverse hagiography, where even good occult philosophers, after they die, start developing sinister reputations. Agrippa, for instance, starts being called the Black Magician because he talked to his dog, a clear sign of a Satanist. Yeah. So, one of the things about the operation you may have noticed in Reginald Scott and copied out in a variety of other ways is that some of the easiest ghosts to summon are those that have done themselves in the auto de fe, and it is acknowledged that these were in some way polluted corpses that it required extra efforts often to put them into the ground, to stop them walking the earth again. And there is an ambiguous in-betweenness of these kinds of walking dead. And indeed, there is an uncertain official church line on such ghosts, which we'll talk about a little bit, but in short, Protestant clergy have a tough time talking about the dead because, in theory, they shouldn't be walking the earth at all after they abolish purgatory quite unilaterally with the Reformation. It is only after the Divine Judgment Day that the dead should return at all. There are exceptions, occasionally, but very often ministers like Ludwig Lavater in the 16th century argue that it's the equivalent of UFO denial, right? That it's marsh gas and hoaxes, and occasionally maybe devils in the shape of dead people. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it's significant that the rites of desecration were still employed to those poor souls who took their own lives. And they were, as you can see, denied their usual rites of mourning and various other things. We're going to give an example of a case where someone was haunted by this kind of ghost, probably this kind of ghost. We'll also hopefully start to see how this starts to look strange in terms of, is it a ghost or is it another spirit that's tempting people to kill themselves? So, the famous astrologer William Lilly's former master, when he was an up-and-coming young servant, for many years was supposedly plagued by a spirit who tempted him to kill himself, supposedly. And so he grew melancholy and discontented, which, being carefully observed by his wife, she desired to acquaint the cause of his distemper, which she then did. Away she went to Dr. Simon Foreman, who, having framed this sigil, hanged it about his neck, he wearing it continually until he died, and was never more molested by the spirit. So there we go. So the quick answer is, if you stay in some dodgy hotels, and you find yourself being haunted by a spirit telling you to cut your own throat, go and see a magician, and they'll sort you out with a medallion of some kind, with an amulet. There you go, sorted. What I want to show in that short account is that there is an ambiguity around the fact that the inn room is haunted by something that may have caused the previous occupant to kill themselves, or maybe the ghost of the former occupant. It's very hard to say. The idea that death could permeate a space, not just the dead, but the virtue of death itself, the gravity of the grave had a weight that could stick to you. And that this is one of the dangers in attempting to summon ghosts, is that you're going to bump into them anyway, sometimes. And this is also, I think, demonstrative without psychologizing away a belief in ghosts. It's also clear that there are anti-anxiety functions of these kinds of amulets. One of Foreman's students, Dr. Richard Napier, who was a physician, astrologer, geomancer, and magician with a close relationship with the Archangel Raphael, one of his, we had a statistical analysis of his case notes, because astrologer physicians were some of the first people to keep case notes. Why are you writing things down? Why are you checking the stars? We know that he gave amulets to around a fifth of the patients that came in describing what we would now call suicidal ideation. So this was clearly a thing that a lot of people did. I want to give one other example of, two other examples, one brief, one slightly longer, of when ghosts turn up, ways to summon ghosts that are not like typical ritual magic, that are rather more about unfinished business. So one of these, right? Yeah. So one of these is a classic, right? If you abuse the children, if you deny the children of a dead person their right to their inheritance, it is possible that their mother's ghost will turn up and tell you where you can find the correct legal documents to sort them out, right? The bonds of love extend past the grave, and we're going to give another example of that a bit later. The other example I want to give is, you might be familiar with Pepper's ghost, the illusion. I want to talk to you about Culpeper's ghost. So Nicholas Culpeper was a physician, a pharmacologist, I guess we might say now, an astrologer, and he translates the pharmacopoeia from Latin into the vulgar English, and so suddenly people who couldn't read Latin can start to compound their own cures and things. But his ghost also turns up after he dies, and he does so because this is wonderful. Dr. Nicholas Culpeper, whose ghost appeared to his widow, Alice Culpeper, and spake to her in the lively image of his deceased body, bidding her vindicate him, for he had been abused by some booksellers. Right? So he's unhappy about how his books are being sold after he's dead, so he turns up and he delivers a new book called Mr. Culpeper's Ghost, dealing seasonable advice to lovers of his writings. Which, you know, as you do, I guess, when you're kicking around the afterlife and you're not happy with how people are selling your books. Talk about prolific, right? So we can argue this is kind of a marketing strategy or a literary conceit, but there's a lovely footnote from the printer, Peter Cole, who was genuinely one of Culpeper's friends, who says, it could be any number of things, and I don't want to say that I cavort with necromancers, because obviously that's illegal, but being it hath been my good hap to get a copy of this book, I could not be so forgetful of my old friend, and unfaithful to thee, whom I take to be his friend too, to let it sleep in oblivion, and miss of the good that charitable soul intended thee by it. So, just occasionally, a spirit might turn up to deliver books, which is also something that happens in some very explicit ritual magic contexts that I'm happy to talk about if anyone's especially interested in that. So, we can talk about necromancers themselves as well. Here's an interesting definition from Agrippa in a very sarcastic treatise called The Vanity of the Arts and Sciences, which he writes after his 3 books of occult philosophy get him into trouble, and he has to recant his magic, which he does very sarcastically. And amongst other things, he describes what a necromancer does, which includes not only enchanting the souls of the dead, but also pocket demons, which is just adorable, let's be honest, amongst other things. So, part of the trouble with this, we see again this thing of like necromancers also deal with other spirits that might not have been human or might have been human once but kind of aren't now, but sort of are still, but aren't, but also not. Is a kind of crawler ID, and this is part of the trouble with the whole abolishing purgatory thing. It's not a good look, effectively, and it gives us problems, many problems. One of the main problems, as Ollie Davies points out, is when something weird happens, how do you tell if it's a ghost, or the devil, or little devils, or witches, or fairies, or any combination of those things? This becomes tricky, and so you get these very broad definitions of what a spirit is, which is, any intelligent creature, right? You'll note maybe if you're interested in the work of the angelical operations of Dr. John Dee, that he often refers to spiritual creatures and doesn't give much more definition than that often. He does also refer to them as angels, but this is exactly the kind of potential loophole that allows his detractors to say that he was a dupe and that he was talking to devils or he was being deceived by the seer. Right, these are problematic things and tricky. But I want to leave you with, a necromancy syllabus for a start. So, I promised how to summon ghosts. This is a definition from Thomas Blatt's Glossographia, which is a book of big long words, basically. And he defines necromancer in a very specific terminology, right? You've got your syllabus there, wear black, not just sartorially elegant, but operatively useful. Go without sleep for a while, go without food so that you're hungry, lodge around graves, and so we start to see this kind of dream incubation stuff going on. Right? This is the main agenda, and there are certain words, certain incenses, various other ritual preparations that are made, but this is said to be one of the ways in which one could communicate with the dead, or, as you'll note, the devil in the shape of a dead man. Again, this uncertainty is still there. But this kind of feels like a good summation or précis of a lot of stuff around why one would, or how one would summon the dead. So one of the other ways of summoning the dead was to extract a promise from them, the promise of a condemned man specifically. And Francis Timbers shows us that this kind of way of getting a familiar spirit on board, or as I like to call it, a ghost butler, is to go and speak to someone who is, waiting execution and to extract this promise. And we have an actual example of exactly that from the diaries of a young 17th-century aristocrat called Goodwin Wharton, who fell in, I don't know if he fell in love possibly, but definitely fell in with a slightly dodgy, cunning woman by the name of Mary Parish. And so he details a series of magical adventures which eventually result in the successful completion of a version of this rite of getting a condemned man to promise to come back and be your ghost servant, which he does. So while incarcerated in Ludgate prison for debts of her first husband, the widow Mary Parish had made firm friends with an apparently kindly gentleman named George Whitmore, a very handsome man, she said, well-shaped, with delicate hair, who apparently instantly took a shine to Mary. Being on a sort of day release, George gladly volunteered to do various tasks outside the prison for Mary, checking up on her children and a tailoring business, amongst other things, until one day he didn't return to Ludgate, the debtor's prison. Mary eventually received word that he was in Newgate prison for suspected felons and highwaymen. Forced into desperate circumstances by his debts, George had indeed betook himself to the worst of employments, which was to robbing. And now, so overcome with guilt, he insisted to Mary that he could not make peace with his maker until he had made peace with her. So not in any position herself to beg for leniency of George, he was sentenced to be hanged. Nevertheless, Mary did secure the promise that he would return as a ghostly familiar to continue in her service. We have the brief account of what happened in this text here, which is by Francis Timbers on exactly that. So there's a whole procession of George being taken to his place of execution, and apparently, in contrast to most people who are either just, pretty miserable being taken to be killed by the state, funnily enough, or screaming angry, he's delighted. He's waving to the crowds, he's smiling, he's handing out flowers. He is said to look like a man headed more to his marriage than his funeral. And this is why. He So it said, after Mary saw George's body safely delivered to the church, she proceeded to Moorfields on the north side of the city walls at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In this place of solitude, Mary's grief and anticipation must have been a heady mixture of emotions. Imagine her hopes and fears as she closed her eyes and pictured George as he was alive, well-spoken and witty, who had told her that he loved her above all women in the world. When she opened her eyes, her imagination was personified. George's figure appeared in front of her, saluting her in his familiar manner. The apparition smiled and in a faint and scratchy voice told her he was feeling very weak and he would meet her again on the morrow. The next day she returned to Moorfields and he appeared again, and the next until he had regained his strength and she could hear him in a low voice. And he continued to speak in this low voice throughout her adventures, which included a variety of things. So this is the kind of thing that she may have been saying to get him back. Again, we can see the idea of the promise is supposed to be done on with the book that you have as well, and a whole series of prayer, which we can go into again if we want. But I want to talk about, perishing or deceased. So he brings news from the lowlanders, who are fairies, that Mary and her young aristocrat, who has massive gambling debts, by the way, are off searching for fairy gold. They call them the lowlanders, and they have their whole society, which mirrors the politics that were going on between England and Portugal in some really fascinating ways as well. Besides the point a little bit. So he consults about future possible suitors. She sends him out on fact-finding missions and things like that. He confirms the sexes of kids. He acts as secretary for other spirits who are trying to contact them, so he's a kind of spirit bouncer as well. He helps Mary find witch hazel rods. Remember having the hazel rod? She decides that it needs to be witch hazel, which she can't find around her usual London spots. So she sends George out, who tells her where they are, and she successfully manages to find them based off that. And he takes said rods to a fairy priest to consecrate them as well. The priest is called Father Friar, I think, inventively. He's a ghost butler and a familiar spirit who turns up, and they have a variety of these kind of adventures together. And it's through his love for her, arguably his guilt as well, they were meant to have a nice life together when she got out of debt as prison. But this was entirely the motivating factor. It's thoroughly passionate. And when Thomas says her imagination was personified in front of her, again, I don't want you to think of this as overly psychologizing this. The idea of the imagination is an incredibly powerful image-making faculty to the pre-modern mind, right? You are literally making images in your head that can call by contagion, by reflection, as above, so below, and that kind of thing, the very properties and the occult virtues that you seek to stir. The idea of psychology and psychiatry and spirits being antagonistic as two models that couldn't fit in the same head would be kind of ridiculous to our early modern ancestors. Spirits can inform psychology. Haunting can make you crazy, just as being emotionally disturbed means you're more likely to encounter ghosts. So, in conclusion, there are several ways you can summon a ghost. Obviously, magic books is always good, and magic words, we saw some of those prayers. Likewise, though, you could deal with restless dead, and suicide's not the only form of restless dead. Those who died violently also certainly count. You could get them back on personal matters, whether that's being abused by some booksellers or that your kids aren't receiving their proper inheritance. There could be matters of dream incubation, which seems a very, very important factor. And finally, there is merely the promise between loved ones that hopefully can bring the dead back. And that's a good question.
Our next speaker is Hathaway Diaz. He's a folklorist, diviner, artist, and performer living in New York City. With initiation in several forms of witchcraft, both from Europe and the Americas, he is also a lifelong student of Mexican curanderismo, an initiated Olosha in the Lukumi Orisha tradition, and a Tata Quimbanda. He is also a member of the experimental theater group. Yes, he will talk. Thank you. That's the only one I can. Based in New York City. He's half of the www.wolfandgoat.com, a store specializing in occult art, esoterica, materia magica, from many traditions, including traditional craft and Quimbanda. Please welcome Jesse.
already smudged enough. Let's fight against that. I have to consider perspective here. Which way is that's forward? Yes, okay, good. Hello. Wow, it's more intimidating when you see how many people are here. It's so much easier when we do a podcast now. Okay. So, this talk is kind of a snippet into a much larger collection of brainworms that infect me all the time, which is exploring the identity of what it is that we do, and not just our identity, but to explore what it means to necromance, and what it is to be a magician, what it means to be a literate person, what it means to be a human in all of these things. So the talk right now is the corpse between the covers, summoning the dead through ink and breath, but not in the way that you think. I have my very serious woodcut there, which Al stole from me, to show that I'm a very serious necromancer and magician. But I am someone who, when I give talks, there are multiple titles to the talk because I've wrestled with the talk quite a bit. So just to show, first I wrestled with the picture because I had to prove that I was a serious necromancer and use this image because it's so great. But this is kind of how actually I feel about everything. Yes, so there are possibly other titles to this talk. The first of which is, I read the best books. No one reads better books than me. I've read so many best books that I don't need to read anymore. Believe me, no one necromances better than me. We're going to raise the dead and make them pay for it. Next title. Reading books written 500 years ago by a man I don't know in a language I don't speak, but it's okay because I have Google Translate. Let's summon demons. So this starts to raise a few things for me. What is necromancy? And this is a topic that Al and I, both on record and off record, talk a lot about. One of the explorations of this specific talk is that I'm going to explore how every act of reading is an act of necromancy. And I get goosebumps still thinking about what that means. So, the other side of it is that I am a book lover. My apartment is plagued by this habit. Every wall is covered in books, and I worry that like a grand piano in a poorly rated space will fall through. I worry for my downstairs neighbors. But I also have, in my practice in daily life, the wonderful benefit of participating in oral traditions and what that means to be transmitted things in the same breath as someone who is with you. And a lot of living necromantic traditions are oral traditions. What does that mean for me as well is the notion that how do I rectify these two? And there is a constant, almost mantra for me of burn all books, consume the ashes, and lick the palimpsests clean. We have to internalize what the book is saying. We cannot just read it. And more on this as we go on. This is an evolution of a talk I first gave at the Esoteric Book Conference in Seattle a number of years ago, and still plagues my nightmares since then, because it's a question. So as much as I seem like I might be berating the people who read books or write books or myself, it's in the kind of surgical thing of let's keep going deeper. Bakhtin is amazing. The word does not forget where it has been and can never wholly free itself from the dominion of the context of which it has been a part. Bakhtin there. I hate books, they only teach us to talk about things we know nothing about, or so. This is the great debate for me in looking at what we do. To mistake the book for the words upon its page, this is the ingress, this is the gate, this is how we walk in, these are the bones of the dead. And so Before I get lost in my kind of rabbit hole that will eventually happen no matter where I go, no matter how many notes I have, I'm going to start with this image. There we go. So this is a contemporary Mayan altar in Guatemala. You can see folk Catholic references here, as well as what is a continuation of Mayan value centers, so cosmological things that are in place from before the exposure to Christianity. And of course the next Western influence of soda, because, you know, what deity doesn't want soda? I put this up here because I was fascinated in researching the colonization of the Americas is a big point of study for me, and the changing and the convergence of thought, and heavily dealing with issues of translation, and dealing with what it is to convert. And one of the things that happened in the Mesoamerican conversion, it did not happen before that point. The Spanish, when they came, first they sent Franciscans, which was really new for them because they had radical ways of doing things and really like whipping themselves. But they did not translate into Latin and make them convert, or they did not make the locals learn Latin in order to learn catechism. They translated the Bible into the native languages. Now what this effectively does, linguistically, if you are going to use native deity names instead of Christian and Jewish names, you have not changed the actual religion or belief. You've added to it, you've complicated it, but you have not changed it, you have not converted. If you are going to say, Ipal Nemwani, he in whom we move and have our existence, instead of Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh, you have not changed the belief about it. You've just said, we have a different story about that deity. So the conversion of Mesoamerica, arguably, by many standards, never happened. It just agglutinated. So human sacrifice, now you have Jesus on a cross. These things kind of spread out. And so it becomes very complex, especially for the identities of those people who exist in both those worlds at the same time. Now, when the word for book did not exist in the majority of Mayan dialects, what did the Franciscans do? They talk with people and try and explain what it is, and the word that was arrived at, the Mayans refused. They did not like the word that the Spanish were trying to create what the word book was, because the Mesoamericans didn't have codices. They had accordion-folded books that mirrored the structure of the universe, which was believed to be like stacked folded cloth with the multiple layers. And those books were microcosms of the universe, but they were open to interpretation and had to be transmitted through being taught what those things were, as opposed to someone could just magically open it and know what it was by looking at it. So the concept of a book, especially a non-sacred book, was very confusing. What did they call them? They decided to use the word for altar. Because an altar contains the prayers of the people who have gone to it to seek and to serve. An altar contains the texts of those who have come to it. So the book is an altar. Complication number one. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 9, and God said, let the waters be collected. Those of you familiar with biblical Hebrew, you know that the letters themselves, the consonants, and the dots, the red dots here, are the vowels. But the vowels are not originally written in Semitic languages. And I'm thankful to a lecture a few years back by David Chaim Smith that was kind of complicated my life in matters, because so we are made in the image of God in Judeo-Christianity. We are imbued with the breath of God. Now, we in necromancy talk about resurrecting the dead by breathing life, giving spiritus back to the dead to animate them. This is one form of necromancy. The other form is directly to interact with the spiritus of the dead. So you can interact with physical remains or non-physical permanence, because it's not really remains. It was preternatural and keeps going. But if we look at these letters and know that the vowels are not originally part of it, I would propose that these letters are like the dry clay. that by knowing, by being transmitted from the breath of someone who can teach what the vowels of those words are, therefore transmission from God, the breath passing through, we animate the dry bones of those words. Vowels are spirit. Consonants are matter, they are bones. So the very act of pronouncing this, of deriving meaning from these symbols, is an act of co-creating the universe. This, okay, so because of this, we are using our ruach to animate those dry bones of those letters. But what if I don't know what that word is? Without the vowel marks, it could be many words. Well, this is by context. This is by engaging in transmission from somewhere else, being taught these things from someone else's breath. The combination of oral and textual transmission. Through textual transmission, we can pass more than what we can by basic contact, but here we become gods in reading, in looking at the ink on this page, which we can go into the matter of crushed bone and charred bone and lampblack and what those things are that actually make ink, but you know, we have a finite amount of time tonight. Yeah. Every act of reading is a necromantic act. This got complicated a few minutes ago when I realized when I was talking, I'm thinking about this, the freezing of things in time, but then what is it when I'm reading my own words or reading a script that I've written that like, oh, there was the depth of me there, and then now it's being animated again because I can never capture again what that was at that time period. But okay, so the question becomes, what kind of God are you when you animate the text? When you animate the bones? The lovely aside here of looking at mercury, sulfur, and salt, the alchemical display, as voice, breath, and speech, or essence, nature, and display. That the breath, the spiritus, that allows the voice, the transmission, that allows the words, the speech to be fully articulated. Something really beautiful in this very complexifying attitude towards this. Okay. Ultimately, no one can hear in things, books included, more than he already knows. If you have no access to something from experience, you will have no ear for it. Bastard. Okay. Nietzsche is a bastard, yes. Nietzsche is the reason I don't have a philosophy degree. I walked out with 4 credits away from my master's. I just think I can't do this. So, to talk a little bit here, we often talk about orthodoxy versus orthopraxy in Western occultism. And necromancy is very heavily orthopraxy. There is a ritual, a transmission, a way of doing things that is held intact and moves forward, but not necessarily an intact cosmology. The cosmology changes based on whatever the person's exposed to. But if we recreate the world with our breath every time we read it, every time we read a sentence and we are putting it in there, the question becomes, language itself is a cosmology, and we can go off on the Hauser Wirth hypothesis, which gets disproved and reproved every year by whoever likes it. But the idea that language expresses and reifies your reality. That what you think and how you think it and the language that you are thinking in changes the way you metaphysically view the universe. It confirms it. If you start to speak more than one language, you become very confused by this war between the worlds there. It is much easier to speak languages that are of a similar construct, Indo-European languages. When you add in an Amerindian language, things change completely. The whole concept of structure changes. For me, growing up with multiple languages, just the difference between English and Spanish was apparent, but when I learned Basque as an adult, suddenly I lost all concepts of gender because Basque has no gender, but it was very heavily concerned with how close everything was to you. In order to refer to not him or her, but this one, that one, and that one over there, suddenly everything became in concentric rings. That if I switched to English, I didn't think like that. There was no concern of the distance. There was a looking at the person's face and trying to remember their exact name. But it was a language that was built on how close something was proximally to you. What is the compromise between these complications? Oh, Chumley. Okay. Mistake not this book for the words upon its pages. It's a celebration of the text. We need the text, but we also need to understand that the text is more than what is on the page, and we are adding to it. And if we are adding to it, if we are not conscious what we are adding and filling in with our breath, with our own vowel points, we're being sloppy. We are perhaps missing what we are changing in our understanding. So we resurrect the ghost, but the ghost is speaking in a language that we don't understand, and we therefore project our understanding of what that language is upon the ghost, and therefore something is lost in translation. I'm curious where this comes. Is like, what is the compromise between all these things? There is the concept of the Book of Cyprian, which in Mexican thought, which is one of many traditions that work with the Cyprianic legends, that any book of magic is a book of Cyprian, and that ultimately the Book of Cyprian is a blank book that you are writing. This is the important thing. What is being transmitted to you? What are you retaining in the book of your mind? That the Bible is not finished. There's white on the page left. Only when darkness overtakes the whole Bible, meaning ink is completely covered in it, that you will bring the second coming, which is a whole other wonderful superstition there. Also, the notion that this carries over in many parts of Western Europe, especially Spain, Portugal, and France, that if there was a prominent author, that oftentimes they gave their name to a branch or a type of book. So magic books start to be called Agrippas. Not because it's written by Agrippa, but because Agrippa wrote a really important occult philosophical text, but therefore any book written by anybody on the occult philosophy might be called, that book will be called an Agrippa in that tradition, much like Xeroxing or that product death when your brand name becomes a verb. It's not good for business. Now, there's no words on that one. That's just stuff I can't understand. That's great. Okay. Concepts of authorship, access, and perhaps digestion come into play here. If all acts of reading are necromantic, is writing a burial? What is it that we do when we write things down? There was a woman who was born Roma, commonly known as Gypsy, and she went around and was collecting, I think it was in the 1960s and 70s, was collecting folklore of her people, and she was secretly recording it and writing it down to try and have towards a degree to document oral lore. When it was published, she was kicked out of her community, and the complaint was that in writing oral stories down, they could not be changed to be relevant to the present time. She had betrayed her people by writing down that which should only be spoken. Writing is a burial. It stops and freezes something in time. So, similar to each of us bearing the imprint, the terroir of our lives on our bones that can be resurrected and played with and talked with, this war between the oral and the textual, the extant and the revived. I'm more interested in the co-creation of it. Again, what breath are you putting into the words that you read? Where are you filling things in? The notion of translation is not an exact science. You can take my sincerity on that for those of you that are monolingual. For anybody who is close to bilingual or more, you understand that there is no such thing as translation. There is not. Translation is an approximation and it's a guess. It's a game of charades. There is no such thing as a perfect, ideal, or correct translation. The translator is always trying to extend his knowledge and improve his means of expression. He is always pursuing facts and words. Keynote pursuing, not capturing. Peter Newmark. There is also the notion, let me throw out a Brazilian colloquialism, ser bonito como pau do outro, making yourself beautiful with someone else's cock. The concept of stealing mind or theft of mind in esoteric Judaism is a thing. Not crediting your teachers, not crediting authors, not crediting your train of thought, means that you are taking away from someone that actually might know more about it and taking the position of authority on something, that people are going to come to you and you're not going to pass them to someone that could teach them more. You are thieving the student that you are so excited to share something with if you do not share where you got it from. Now, this could be a lovely way of guilting you into attributing everything to God, which it was used in Catholicism very happily. There is the notion, though, of anybody, when you study an oral tradition, you always say that I do believe the kind of preamble and the excuse you give of whatever is good in what I'm saying, it's because of my elders. Whatever I'm wrong and corrupting in what I'm saying is my fault. Both things are true. It does not mean that everything good that I do is all the praise is due to my elders. It's because of the relationship with them. And that is something to examine. So what do we do when we have a book? We have a book. We have these bones. We reanimate them with our breath. And we have a certain meaning to it that is frozen in time, even our concept of understanding. And we know that the more you think about something, the more your memory changes it about it. I mean, that's just terrible. The more you think about something that happened to you, the more you're not actually remembering what happened. Science, terrible. You can talk about things of borrowed or earned reputation, but I think what's also important here is that, if I can stay on this last very colloquial expression of making yourself beautiful with someone else's cock, you can't fuck somebody with someone else's cock. So what kind of God are you? What kind of necromancer are you? He who would become an accomplished Mason must not be content merely to hear or even to understand the lectures. He must, aided by them, and they having, as it were, marked out the way for him, study, interpret, and develop these symbols for himself. Albert Pike, Morals of Dogma. Now, Albert Pike's a very complicated figure, but these words kind of sting when I look at him. What is interesting here is that the possibility is handed to someone in the printed text. The potential of bones and what those are handed to the necromancer. They might not be able to animate them. They might be able to animate them partly. Depending on your training, maybe you have forensic anthropology background and you can look at it and tell me everything that happened to that person around the moment of their death and what time they broke their bones and how it went from there. That is one form of necromancy, certainly. How does that become relevant for us past that? Okay, we can serve on warnings, but when we start to apply, we have to be familiar, we have to be open to what we're being told. A child has the potential for language, but does not necessarily understand complexity of thought and what you are saying. Gurdjieff recommended that you read every book 3 times, once for yourself, once out loud, and once as if you were transmitting it. Now I'm going to be shot down for that because I just horribly paraphrased that. But 3 times, that part is true. I guess what it comes down to is book as idol and eidolon, perhaps. This is Spanish prayer of the book. En el nombre del Padre, en el nombre de Madre, en el nombre de su vientre, en las semillas de las hojas. In the name of the Father, the front cover of the book. In the name of the Mother, the back cover of the book. In the name of her womb, the spine of the book. In the name of the seeds, the words that are printed on the page. In the name of the leaves, the papers themselves. Some will argue the switch between seeds and leaves. But the important thing is that this is a womb of potential. That the white space in between the words on the pages is, how do we learn to read? We learn by eclipsing the page with ink, right? It's revelatory of Goffman, other things that came on the connections between the eclipse and knowledge and the darkening that happened at Jesus' death, stealing that breath for the devils of the world to be able to tell us things like winning lottery numbers and which girl likes you and who's saying bad things about you. But the idea that the book itself is a womb and a potential rather than the authority is quite fascinating to me. And when we look at the record of a spirit coming down and yelling at you, and you can point like, buy the book that I learned this crap from, you can't come near me, and you show them the book. This is what potentially I could do to you. I don't know how to do it all yet, but I could do these things. So get back, my book. So, for me, I'm curious if we, I have no idea where the actual thing that makes this thing happen is. Oh, okay. You got me? Last slide. Incompetence with technology is amazing. Okay. Here's the same title from before this, the very last slide.
We lost it. Come back.
It's the last 20 minutes flashing before me. Okay. Little deaths, over and over and over. It's very polite. So, I'm curious how we become eaters of the dead. Hold on. How we consume books, how they digest within us. What is the metaphor here of necromancy? As someone who is a firm believer in the power to talk to the dead and interact with the dead, and what those things are, or perhaps it's devil's tricking me the whole time. Sometimes I don't care the reason behind it, just make sure that the answer is correct. Anybody familiar with the concept of the Kalunga, which is West African Congolese idea of the ocean of the dead that permeates everything? It is the friction born between the world of matter and the world of spirit, and like a self-lubricating onion, it is both fire and water. And this invisible lubricating layer, this ocean of the dead, flows through and around everything that can possibly die, and therefore permeates and penetrates our material world. It connects us to everything that has died and everything that will die. This is the lubrication of our work. This is the mercury of magic in a Congolese context. Things must pass through the Kalunga in order to get from the world of the living to the world, from the world of the dead, and vice versa. And this is the mirror and the layer of water that we must cross. It is expressed in the ocean that surrounds the world. It is expressed in the fluids that merge in the dirts of the cemetery and connect us all to the earth again. It is the water that falls down from the firmament that becomes the ocean and circulates under the underworld and comes back up through evaporation. So how do we let the Kalunga wash over us? How do we, the fish, know that we are swimming in water? And how do we ultimately inspire and respire to allow the breath of this moment, our context, everything we've learned up until this point, everything we've forgotten up until this point, reanimates that which has been before in the form of written words, in the bones of the dead, in our bones. What breath outlasts us? The beauty of the written word to allow us to have a memorial past our death, to determine part of the spirit that can animate us in the future, to build the body of light by metaphor. So, at least what we do with it, that's ours. And so I guess the challenge, the excitement in it for myself, and I would propose for all of you, is to embrace every act of reading as the illegal act of necromancy. Cherish the fact that you are contributing to that book as you read it. And if you do not want to acknowledge that, you're lost. Because you are changing what you are reading. And if you're not aware of what you're changing, you cannot guide the change and you cannot move it forward. Instead, you destroy it. So you bury the bones a second time if we are not conscious of what our breath is doing to it. I'm going to stop there before I bury a hole. But for anyone interested in whatever these relationships are, please give Al and I run a podcast called Radio Free Goal with that. It is mostly us talking impromptu about certain topics, Sesame Street style, and it's an exploration of all these things on a constant basis for us. There'll be a new episode up this Friday. So check us out, and thank you for your ears and your breath.
So, our next speaker, Mallorie Vaudoise, is a Brooklyn-based spiritualist of Italian descent. She's currently apprenticing with renowned Italian folk musician Alessandra Belloni. Vaudoise is the creator of Italian folk magic, a a blog dedicated to the cults of the Madonnas, saints, and the dead. Please welcome Mallorie Vaudoise.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
My name is Mallorie Vaudoise, and I just want to take a moment right now to thank Jesse and Dr. Al for inviting me here tonight, the lovely ladies at Morbid Anatomy for organizing this event, and the good people at Hauser Wirth for giving us a home for tonight. And I hope that I'm not disappointing too many of you in the audience when I reveal that tonight's talk is about Naples, Italy, not Naples, Florida. Although I'm pretty sure they have a lot of necromancy going on in Florida. They're probably like the necromantic capital of the US. This is the Naples that we're going to be talking about. It was first settled by Greek colonists in 2000 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban areas in human history. And looming in the background, you see the form of Mount Vesuvius, which is one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world due to the proximity of roughly 3 million people who live in the nearby countryside against their better judgment. Vesuvius is kind of like the physical manifestation of the constant threat of annihilation that has shaped southern Italian culture. It's a region that has suffered regular plagues, wars, earthquakes, foreign invaders, and famines, and that's in addition to the volcanic activity. So any religion that wants to take root in this soil needs to account for the background noise of existential threat, which is a feature of the landscape. Italy is officially a Catholic country, but as we'll see tonight, there are actually many cults that are active within the framework provided by Catholicism, including cults dedicated to saints, spirits of the dead, and the Madonna, as the Blessed Virgin Mary is called. There we go. So one such cult is found at Fontanelle Cemetery, an underground ossuary beneath the Mater Dei section of Naples. Most Neapolitans in the 16th century wanted to be interred in their local churches, but because space within the city limits was at a premium, older remains had to be transferred to a final resting place that had a larger capacity, enter the need for Fontanelle. Over the centuries, Fontanelle Cemetery became the place to bury the city's homeless, as well as people from all social classes during times of plague and war, when mass deaths could outpace the city's ability to deal with them. The cult operated primarily through individual mediums, who would establish a kind of necromantic pact with one of the anime pezzentelle, or lost souls, as the spirits of the dead buried in Fontanelle Cemetery are called. These are souls without families, to care for them by paying for masses or offering indulgences in their name. If any of you are Catholic, that's standard necromantic tech that you should really look into. It's definitely worth getting familiar with. Participation in the cult was said to begin, as all good things do, with a dream. The devotee would meet a soul in her dream who would tell her where she could find the soul's skull in the caves beneath the city. And I say she because these devotees were almost exclusively female, and this cult was understood explicitly as women's work. The process of initiatory contact with the dead is described as adoption, and the words used to describe the souls themselves, such as anime pezzentelle, are diminutive. So the central metaphor at play is one in which the devotee is a mother and the soul that she works with is her child. And that's interesting to me because it's kind of It's an inversion of the usual Catholic metaphor in which the devotee is the child and the Madonna is his or her mother. And I've also seen several comments made to the effect by historians that this cult would experience intense waves of revival after plague or war, when not only were there a fresh new crop of souls to choose from, but there were also a lot of women mourning their children. Once the devotee had located the skull of her primary spirit contact within the caves, she would claim it by leaving a coin on it. Then she would begin a process of testing the soul's powers. The devotee would make requests, and if those requests were fulfilled, she would bring rewards of increasing value to the skull. She may begin with white embroidery or candles or rosaries, all of which were believed to ease the soul's suffering in the fires of purgatory by offering it refreshment. A particularly efficacious spirit would receive a small house where the skull could reside with more privacy and dignity than the other inhabitants of the cemetery. As the relationship between devotee and soul deepened, the soul would begin to share information about its earthly life, its social class, vocation, gender, whether it had any children, those types of mundane details. And since plague does not discriminate, the spirits of Fontenelle Cemetery could be literally anyone, offering the devotee access to uniquely diverse perspectives. In 1969, Cardinal Ursi of Naples decided that the cult had degenerated into fetishism and ordered the cemetery to be closed. It has recently reopened, but only as a historical landmark, and cult activities such as leaving refreshments out for the souls are now explicitly forbidden. Interestingly, I see a parallel here with what's happened in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, a popular tourist destination in New Orleans where the famous voodoo priestess and modern folk saint Marie Laveau is buried. If you haven't been there in recent years, you can no longer enter St. Louis without a licensed tour guide who is responsible for making sure you don't leave any kind of offerings or mark tombs according to local custom. And while I sympathize with the desire to protect history so that future generations can enjoy it, I think that there is a tension here that it's worth calling out. Without the offerings, which are evidence of engagement with spirits, there wouldn't really be tourists going to Fontenelle Cemetery or to St. Louis. Life is messy, and we can't kill things in order to preserve them. Returning to Naples, the process of dream interpretation which would guide the devotee in her deepening relationship with her spirit contact was most likely personal or inherited through family. In practice, there is no universal dream dictionary. But we do find several fascinating texts from Campania, the region that Naples is in, which recorded comprehensive systems of dream interpretation that apparently worked for someone at some time, and which may have helped other practitioners to fill in the gaps when they needed inspiration. One such text, the famous Smorfia Napolitana, mapped dream images to the numbers 1 through 90 in order to generate bets to play in the Italian national lottery, because what else are you going to do if you can do magic? This practice might sound silly at first, but it reflects a worldview in which synchronicity exists between images and numbers and between days and names due to the symbiotic relationship between the living and the dead. The other side of this coin is none other than the Catholic ecclesiastical calendar itself, which maps days of the year to saint names. And I know some Italians still celebrate their Onomastico, that is, the feast day of the saint that they were named for instead of their birthday. And because many Italians are named for dead relatives, there's kind of a necromantic side to this practice. Sometimes Italian Americans will reach out to me to ask about how they can learn more about their spiritual heritage. And often the first piece of advice that I have to give them is to just draw up a family tree and start to look for patterns in the names, because that's often indicative of a relationship with a saint that has transcended generations and is likely to have been inherited in some form. But while the Schmorka Napoletana is the best known Neapolitan dream dictionary, I have a special place in my heart for this book, Il Libro Magico di San Pantaleone, whose feast day is coming up, July 27th, in case you guys want to catch that. A Neapolitan grimoire of saint magic, which includes a dream dictionary called Il Libro delle Sette Streghe, the Book of Seven Witches. The Book of Seven Witches translates dream images into omens, which I find fit into the following categories. There are general good and bad omens. So, for example, dreaming of a hot summer is a good sign, but dreaming of an owl is a bad sign. There are omens which predict specific events. So, taking a bath indicates that a famine will come soon, while a small mouth predicts riches. Then there are omens which predict the outcome of some prayer which has been made. A clock indicates that the prayer is on its way to being fulfilled, while riding black horses indicates that prayer is useless in addressing the matter. And finally, there are instructions for making the prayer more efficacious. Building a church indicates that the prayers that have already been offered were sufficient. Seeing a cleric indicates that you must add a requiem for the dead to your prayers. And being blind in one eye warns that the prayer was misquoted. Interestingly, the way that the book is written seems to imply a social structure in which the operator is the person designated to dream on behalf of his or her family. This, along with the devotees at Fontenelle Cemetery who would build small houses for their working skulls, reminds me of something that we see in Italian-American culture, where women would often be responsible for praying to, communicating with, and sometimes even bargaining with the Madonnas and the saints. If a particularly important favor was received from one of their spirit contacts, they would ask their husbands, many of whom were stonemasons by trade back in the day, to build a yard shrine as a sign of gratitude. So the next time that you're walking down the street in Brooklyn and you see a beautiful bathtub Madonna like this one, keep in mind that that statue was not purely an aesthetic choice or even just a marker of ethnic identity. It was put there to honor a spirit who came through for the family that lived in that apartment in their moment of need. So far, the practices that we've discussed have focused on personal relationships with spirits, but I'd like to shift our focus now towards more community-oriented traditions. This is the Madonna dell'Arco, who resides in the town of Santa Anastasia near the city of Naples. This site was originally home to an edicola votiva, that is, a roadside shrine. It was called the Madonna dell'Arco after a nearby arch left behind from an ancient Roman aqueduct. On Easter Monday of 1450, a young man angry at losing a card game threw a ball at the image whose cheek began to bleed where she had been struck. This was interpreted as a miracle by the local people, who consequently asked that the young man be put on trial, and he was found guilty and hanged. Which actually brings up another interesting point, which is that the Madonnas in southern Italy tend to kind of defy American expectations. They're not the kind of sweet, gentle, loving mother figure that American Catholics might have been introduced to in CCD. They're deadly, terrifying, and they demand respect, much like Italian mothers. This is precisely why they are worshipped, because they are powerful and they can use that power for us or against us, much as earlier pagan deities were believed to do. Since that first incident, the Madonna dell'Acqua has been celebrated every Easter Monday. Her most committed devotees are known as the Fuggenti, who you see in this image. They show their devotion to the Madonna by walking barefoot during her procession and even dropping to their knees and crawling on all fours when they enter her sanctuary. In many instances, Fuggenti who come close to the Madonna will fall to the ground, shouting and convulsing. And some may find this practice a bit similar to how practitioners of Afro-diasporic traditions might mount spirits in certain other ritual contexts. But you can judge for yourself because her devotees actually have a surprisingly active presence on Facebook, and they live stream this shit every year. The Madonna dell'Acqua was one of the famous Sette Sorelle, or seven sisters, each of whom is worshipped in a different site in Campania. These Madonnas are honored with traditional music, known as Tamuriate, which I have been honored to learn from my teacher, master folk musician Alessandra Belloni. Tamuriate is not simply a genre of music or dance. It is an ecstatic spiritual practice, something which Alessandra emphasizes in her work. It is embedded in the agricultural way of life of southern Italy. As one interview subject in the documentary Dancing on the Drum by Zoe DeMauro puts it, Tamuriate is an expression of everyday life. For me, it's my childhood, my people. It's me, my culture. It's not simply a matter of passion, it's something natural to me. Tamuriate is a moment in life. It rises and dies. The drum is made of a membrane that produces a vibration, a sound. At a certain point, after drinking some wine, when you begin to get closer to God, this sound takes you deeper and deeper into a state of trance. There, you start to perceive vibrations which you cannot normally perceive. So this isn't just some new age idea that has been grafted onto an existing tradition. The practice of Tamuriate is, and always has been, about trance and contact with other parts of reality. Traditionally, it is not performed so much as experienced within the context of a religious feast. There is no stage, just a circle of musicians surrounding the dancers. Its lyrics, always explicitly sexual, are drawn from a vast repertoire, although the arrangement is improvised by the singer every time. The musicians interpret the lyrics into drumming patterns, which in turn correspond to certain dance steps. Much of the choreography mimics actions related to agricultural labor. The dance is partnered and resembles a courtship. Similar traditions of music and dance existed in the ancient world, particularly in the rites of the goddess Cybele and the god Dionysos, both of whom were worshipped through ecstatic rituals which called for frame drums similar to the ones used in Tamuriate today and which took place in the same geographical region. And both Cybele and Dionysos served religious functions related to death, dying, and the dead. Along with the cult at Fontenelle Cemetery, Tamuriate was suppressed by the powers that be in the 1950s and 60s. It made a comeback in the 1970s and again in the late 1990s, and is quite popular today. A related musical tradition, the Pizzica Tarantata from Puglia, has experienced a similar revival after years of suppression. That name means bite of the tarantula and refers to the phenomenon of tarantismo, which was first described in the 11th century. Tarantismo is commonly described according to the following mythic pattern. A peasant woman is working in the fields at high noon when she is bit by a spider or a snake, or stung by a scorpion and then overcome by illness. Perhaps manic or perhaps melancholic, the woman, who is called a tarantata, will die if drastic measures are not undertaken. The only known cure is an ecstatic dance ritual which can last anywhere from 3 to 7 days. During this time, a group of musicians must play continuously, allowing her to dance the poison out. It's a stunning scene. but it excludes a few key details which are related to us by Ernesto de Martino in his classic book, The Land of Remorse. De Martino explains that each spider had its own rhythm and color. The musicians would need to play several options, watching the body of the tarantata for a response. When the correct music was played, the tarantata would leap to her feet and begin dancing uncontrollably. The women from the village would put out their clothes so that once in communion with the spirit of the animal that bit her, the tarantata could dress herself in its heraldic colors. Many tarantate learned the names of their spiders, which were usually female, and even after a cure was received, the tarantata would typically need to undertake a similar ritual once a year to avoid the deterioration of her condition. Most often, this would take place on June 29th, and a similar ceremony is going to be held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine uptown, if you're interested, and Alessandro will be conducting the ceremonies there. But I emphasize these elements because I find them shockingly similar to another tradition of music and dance found in nearby lands, Zar. Zar is a women's spirit possession cult found primarily in Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, although similar traditions are found in other parts of Africa and the Middle East. Within the worldview of Zar, spirits of the dead sometimes choose female hosts to possess. At first, this possession is experienced as an illness, but over time it may evolve into positive concern for the host's well-being, particularly once she's undergone a healing ceremony, which involves music, dance, and animal sacrifice, and like the ritual used to cure the tarantata, typically lasts 3 to 7 days. After the ceremony, the initiate learns how to allow the spirit to enter her body through deliberate trance rather than unwilling possession. Like the tarantismo ritual, the Zar ceremony involves drumming, dance, and costumes, which correspond to the spirit's identity. And like the tarantata, the Zar initiate must perform sacrifices to her spirit once a year in order to stay on good terms with it. I am not the first person to comment on the ritual similarities between tarantismo and Zar, and if these similarities have not led us astray, we may infer some beliefs from the oral tradition of tarantismo which did not make it into the written record. The spider, snake, or scorpion may have been the spirit of a deceased person afflicting the tarantata, and once she had appeased that spirit through the proper rituals, the tarantata may have had a relationship with it, which enabled her to do the things that we call magic. When I was younger, I looked around and I saw the paucity of magic in my culture as an Italian American, and I assumed that it must be because magic is like some very technical thing. And you know, I'm a very technical person. I'm actually a software engineer by training, so like that's what I was looking for, right? But when we take a step back and we look at all of the cults that we've talked about tonight side by side, Fontanelle Cemetery, the Madonna dell'Arco, Tarantismo, what we notice is that there's actually very little set in stone. Even the lyrics of the Tamuriata are improvised. There are technologies, yes, the white embroidery left out for the anima pezzentella, the self-mortifications performed by the fuyenti, and the traditional rhythms of the pizzica tarantata. But these are shockingly simple practices, not much more complicated than lighting a candle and saying a prayer. So I think the challenge is not in the technique. The techniques, after all, are just a starting point. Necromancy is a conversation with the dead, and the traditional techniques will establish a connection, but it's up to the devotee to speak and to listen in turn. The real challenges come once that connection has been established. And I think that these challenges will look familiar to anyone. Who do you trust? Who has the power to help you? How do you maintain boundaries? And how do you do right by the ones you love? Today, I feel like we're seeing this new wave of interest in magic and the occult, and consequently, I see a lot of people posting pictures on Instagram of like altars covered in animal skulls and crystals. And well, don't get me wrong, that's totally my aesthetic, or at least one of my many aesthetics. I'm less interested in seeing your skulls and more interested in seeing what you do with them. Because the dead can reveal many things, from hidden histories to possible futures to winning lottery numbers. So please bring them interesting questions. Thank you.
Would you guys like to take some questions? Would you like to go back on stage, although we don't have chairs? Would you bring your chairs? Maybe? Bring chairs?
I'm new to necromancy, so forgive me if this is a one-on-one level question. What do you guys do in your personal lives for your rituals to commune with the dead that you want to talk to or, love on?
That question.
Hello?
That question is dope. And also, I think, speaking as someone who trained as a software engineer, I feel like it is kind of public service announcement time. When a community makes people apologize for feeling like they're asking one-on-one questions, that's a sign of a toxic community. So please keep asking questions regardless of whether you think that they're good questions or not. That's kind of an important part of the dialogue that these two have started to kind of strike up through the Folk Necromancy Facebook group and through their podcast, Radio Free Golgotha. In terms of my personal practice, I'm afraid it's probably going to look quite vanilla. At least the stuff that I will admit to publicly will look quite vanilla. So the cult at Fontenelle Cemetery is very much embedded in that terroir. It exists because of the fact that certain historical forces have resulted in a bunch of unresolved dead, restless dead, as Dr. Al brought up earlier, who are ready, willing, and eager to interact with people. And so there really isn't much sense in trying to recreate that if you do not live near a major ossuary, which as far as I know, New York has many things, but no major ossuaries or charnel houses nearby. I am a practicing Catholic, and I know that for some people that's going to be like a bridge too far, and that's cool. So a lot of the prayer that I use is Catholic prayers, whether those are official prayers in Latin or whether those are folk prayers in the various regional languages of my ancestors, including Neapolitan and Sicilian. And I find that in doing the drumming work that I do with Alessandra and learning to alternate through certain states of trance, that prayer becomes this whole other thing. It's no longer just like, maybe what your mom made you do before bed, but it's actually a great way of facilitating, a connection with something other than yourself.
So I'm very interested in that idea of, I don't know if I'm projecting on that question there. You said, like, what do you do with your dead? And I'm really interested in, like, who are the dead you consider yours? So, for instance, I'm from the Midlands, from Birmingham, so in the UK, so all my nans are Irish, because that's the rule. And so we have a bunch of similar naming traditions. So, I have pictures on the wall of, my great-grandmother who regularly talked to our dead relatives and set places for them, and also taught pranayama yoga for 45 years. When she was asked how she squared her Irish Catholicism with her pranayama practice that she would do in Mass, she would say, well, I sit, I'm not going to do her accent, I would sit next to a pillar, so in case it won't look too in, and I just don't tell the priest. So I have her up, right? And I also have I work with some saint statues that have the same names as my Irish dead that I know about because of our strange Irish naming traditions. My middle name is Joseph, after my Uncle Harry, whose middle name was also Joseph. It skips generations and does strange loop-de-loops and things like that, but it's also why my father is Michael, and so I work with a variety of statues at the very least that provides access, shall we say, to a set of those saints and archangels, and also that they provide a sense of the access to those minds. That said, my dead I also consider in some ways that a good responsible necromancer can be, providing a safe sort of astral super kitchen occasionally, with some strong provisos and limitations and the equivalent of bouncer spirits that I talked about. And so there are traditions of feeding the lonely souls in purgatory, of praying for them, of offering them water and refreshment, in much the same way that we talked about refresca for the skulls of Fontenelle. And also doing certain things at the nearest cemetery to me, cemeteries when I go and visit them, real arcane stuff like picking up trash and that kind of thing, and hopefully being of some kind of service, amongst other things. Hopefully it's not all take. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
I think the examination of your relationship with your own dead and family is the start in many traditions into working with dead that aren't of your family. I think it's also good to allow for milk children, as we would say in Spanish, but the adopted family, the family that you chose and have chosen, and the lineage of those people, which can also include professions, cities, the dead that have inhabited your space of living. What do you know about the former owners of your apartment? Who has exchanged their last breath there, and who are you sharing that breath with still? With family, I think the healthy way to engage it is also to examine for myself, the patterns that I want to encourage in myself, and to actively heal the patterns that are destructive towards my aims in life that were laid down by family. And sometimes this is a second layer to the work. There is the kind of wonderful quote-unquote worship of the dead, but is an interaction and exchange of offerings and prayers, and trying to get to that point of spirit contact and spirit sight where hopefully you or someone in your family can speak on behalf of the dead. And this is the other thing that in a lot of the extant traditions of this sort, the pressure is not all on you. If someone has the gift, nourish them, encourage them, support them so that they can perform this for you. It does not have to be everyone becomes a super duper necromancer. In empowering others, we empower ourselves, and in a family, that is one of the best divisions of labor. So I think in understanding what is necessary for the dead and the multiple inheritances that we receive, as well as those we do not want to receive anymore, and how do we heal the dead so that those patterns isn't just about our saying, I don't accept that pattern of abuse in a family member or whatever this is, but how does that abuse cycle get healed so that future generations in your family are not subject to those influences and patterns. And it's funny, in raising the dead, we raise ourselves. I'm a firm believer in the ladder principle, that in order to ascend the ladder, you must bring somebody up to the rung below you, so that there's no vacuum and things don't fall, which means we are ultimately trying to empower and build each other up. And specialization is great, diversification is great, but how do I engage the dead? Hopefully in some manner and in some way the way that I engage the living. And how do I converse with the dead? The patterns of how I'm able to communicate with the living are there too. And there are certain allowances. We walk around naked in our house and forget that, the dead shrine is active and great grandma's seeing you diddle yourself is a totally different adventure. But have to perhaps, social mores aside, I think establishing patterns in your living life of interacting with people will help you greatly in how you interact with the dead. And again, build each other up and let what needs to die, allow it to die, and what needs to move on. And you don't have to make those judgments yourself. You can include friends and family and your children. Have great conversations with 4-year-olds about who they remember that they never met and what they want from that interaction. So I think the fun part of your questions and asking what we're doing, it kind of is, it seems like you're also asking what can you do, which is, hey, that's awesome.
Any other question? Raise your hand.
Hello. So recently, my grandmother and stepmother moved on, and I missed the presentation, so my question might be completely off base. But I had an experience in my room where I used cannabis, and there was a moment in between, right after my grandmother's funeral and right after my stepmother's funeral, where I just felt an immense amount of love. It was really strange, and I started bawling my eyes out. I wasn't sad, I was extremely ecstatic. And it's the only 2 times this ever happened in my life. And I'm wondering if chemicals or substances can be used as a lubricant or a vehicle to necromancy, whether you or friends of yours. Or was I just delusional from the cannabis? Like, have you ever heard of anything about this? Was it a hypermanic state? Just some feedback, thank you.
First of all, I would say my condolences, but it sounds like you're having an easy transition here and that there's love on both sides. So I guess really congratulations. That's a rare experience in this culture, unfortunately. There's an incredible book called Cannabis and Spirituality by Stephen Gray is the editor, and in it he interviews several Brazilian people involved in the Santo Daime Church, which is a syncretization of ayahuasca medicine with Christianity. And there was apparently a kind of controversy within the Daime community, which came about when cannabis first was introduced into the rituals. So Daime, that is ayahuasca, is kind of syncretized with Christ, and then cannabis came in and became syncretized with who I would call the Madonna. It was called in the community of Santa Maria. And I think part of the reason for the controversy is because of the fact that cannabis is regarded as particularly attracting spirits of the dead. And depending on what type of spiritual work you're doing, the reason why you are interacting with Christ consciousness or Daime, that might actually be kind of running in like an opposite direction. But that being said, there is certainly, I guess, kind of like a traditional precedent for what it sounds like you have experienced, and I'm sure something that a lot of my friends have also experienced. But of course, Morbid Anatomy, Italian Folk Magic, and Radio Free Golgotha do not encourage the use of any kind of illegal or illicit substances. Can somebody take this away before I say?
The question, I think, from similar experiences in the friend's use of psilocybina. Did you use cannabis or did cannabis use you? Is another question. But I think also there's a lot of emphasis in the way our culture tries to dismiss experiences that are not shared by other people. And that's bullshit. The body does not know the difference between your amorous dream and you enacting it on the emotional level, in the physical, corporeal, shared reality, consensus reality. I'm reminded of discussions we've had, Al, on early modern concepts of seeing and ideas. The Catholic concept of sin and thought is sin indeed is based in this, that if you engage in fantasy, daydream, you're in effect doing that action on some level. So one of the things that happens in spirit contact training is we often tell the person, okay, you don't see anything, pretend that you see something. What color is it? What season is it? What does its voice sound like? And then you start realizing like, oh my God, am I making this up? Or is this actually, doesn't matter because I'm having extreme life positivity or negativity around this interaction. So the first thing I'd say is, if you got a positive experience out of it, fuck what anybody else says. And on the other side of it, keep sending light and love to your dead, and envision them sending it to you, and then what do you do with that receipt of that and how you interact in the world? That's the next step.
It feels like you gave me a lot of knowledge. I'm like a different person since this. People are asking me if I'm a celebrity, am I a comedian?
Yes, you are. You're talking to the dead.
What'd you say?
You are. You're talking to the dead.
Nice.
You're a celebrity. I mean, we can go over and say that you're now a lighthouse, and I'm referencing Ghost, not just the actress who's one person, but the idea that you could find yourself in a lighthouse situation where you are, if we talk about the ocean of the dead, that now things are sailing towards you to try and communicate.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we build up with ancestral dead first is because those communications are the easiest. The promises, the love that continues, the strong emotions that linger. These are their own ghosts, their own spirits, their own demons. But can they be used as a tool? Yes. Could they be used as a crutch? Yes. Could they be used as destructive engagement in the high and the addiction and dependency? Yes. Could necromancy be an addiction like anything else? Yes. But, awesome, congratulations. It's a good way to phrase that.
What role do sacred objects or relics or psychometry or charged objects play in all your work? I noticed that Al talked about a hazel wand, for instance, and I'm sure they're in the Catholic realm, bones of the saints, arms of benediction, etc.
So you're talking materials,
Yes.
tools, things like that, right? So one of the things about the grimoires, the medieval and early modern texts of ritual magic, and there are many kinds of magic books, and books that are magic and books that are about magic, but grimoires are generally said to be particular systems, and one of the things that we kind of get out of them through their filtering through a bunch of the Victorian occultists who got very interested in them is these supposedly huge long lists of elaborate procedures. So it's not just a hazel wand necessarily. One might need to go and cut a branch of a hazel tree that hath not fruited its nut yet on a particular hour on a Sunday with a single cut from a knife that has been made from metal that has killed someone and then been reforged on a particular day after you've turned 3 times sunwards watching a crow fly, etc., etc., etc. Some of this is hyperbole. Some of these 19th century takes on how quote-unquote impossible grimoires are is itself seems a little absurd and frankly lazy, right? Some of it is procedure that can be done. You can get up at sunrise or before sunrise and go to the hazel that you found and cut a rod of a year's growth with a single cut. That's not impossible. And so what interests me in the question about what materials I use or what tools are less about saying you should definitely use hazel and you should never use cypress, and more about the process of gathering them and consecrating them. And consecration not simply is something that's done once, but continually. I, for instance, really enjoy using non-permanent marker of various sorts, chalk, on when I write the names or the seals of spirits on the objects that I use with them, because by handling them, that chalk is wiped off on me and on the things I'm doing, and so I have to re-chalk it. I have to rescale my relationship with that spirit. I end up remembering what it was that I was doing. I am remembering something and giving it more limbs, more neural pathways of every time I've done that. So for me, I use a lot of materials from grimoires. I do use a hazel one and an elder one from the Grimoire of Verum, which is one of my, you're not meant to have favourite grimoires, but that's one of mine.
objects that were inherited, deceased from loved ones, etc.?
No, those were one of those was given by a friend and sort of elder of mine. But I knew a magician who received I used some of the equipment from a magician who passed on his equipment before he died. He received a terminal cancer prognosis and didn't tell anyone, and got a bunch of credit cards and went on a massive tour of the world and took innumerable pictures that he sent to everyone he loved, and then had made arrangements to walk off into a desert. So yes, I also use some tools from a magician friend of mine who happens to be dead. Yeah, I'm going to let these lovely people talk.
In terms of the relationship with my blood ancestors, I find that the charged object that's the most important there is my body, because they made it for me, which is great. Yeah, thanks. They gave me the space, that's great. And you can't spell necromancer without romance, guys. With regard to the veneration of relics, so there's several types of relics. Quick catch up on catechism. There are first-degree relics, which are actual people pieces. And then there are second-degree relics, which are things that have been touched to a first-degree relic. I'm sorry, that's a third-degree relic. And then second is things that they had in their lives. So St. Padre Pio's very fashionable fingerless gloves. And for me, personally, in my relationship with the saints, who I didn't really talk about too much tonight, there needs to be a revisited connection with something tangible and physical for that relationship to be real. So I personally am not a fan of the kind of phone book approach to the saints where it's like, well, this week I need love, so I'm just going to look up who the love saint is, and then I'm going to print out a picture from the internet, and then, that works for some people. It doesn't really work for me. And so in my relationships with certain saints, I try to go on their feast day to their mass in their shrine church and have a contact experience with the relic when it's put out for veneration. And I find that is kind of the charge that I really need to sustain the connection with them the rest of the year, that I can kind of call back on that moment. And I think you can do similar things with pilgrimage. Sacred space is so important, and I think with a lot of the Madonnas who obviously don't really have relics, because even though they are kind of a historical person who lived and died, they're also kind of not. They're related to specific places in the land. They're in Italy, at least, they're often up on a mountaintop, or they were fished out of the sea, or something like that. And so you can also kind of extend this idea of contagion and make it into a pilgrimage, and maybe you go once a year, maybe you go once every 10 years, but allowing yourself to really be present with something that's real, as opposed to just having it purely be an idea, I think brings it into this plane in a very special way. Yeah, do you want to add to that?
In addition to the emphasis on the body and the book, which is an inheritance, which the lineage in Western magic is the book. This book was written by this person who was written, was this given to this person, given this person. Even the citation of authority which you can command spirits is by saying, I am ultimately a child of Adam, who is a child of God, and my authority comes in this way, or I can trace my authority to Solomon, and therefore I am Solomon, and you should pay attention because I have his inheritance here. In addition to those, I'm very interested in the remapping of the landscape we're on. And this can be taken to a very colonial extreme if you're not careful, where you mandate what everybody should remap the landscape as. But this happens a lot in Afro-diasporic traditions. I'm involved in Regladocha, Masantero, as well as Aquimandero, so Orisha tradition that went to Cuba, and as well as the Congolese sorceress tradition that grew up in Brazil. And these two systems, both of them are very concerned with the local, that things have to manifest through the land that we are on. One such way is that if I am worshiping, working with, I guess is a better term, the English word worshiping is strange, but it's another issue. If I'm working with a river deity, and I am not paying attention to the health and nature of these rivers here, what am I doing? If I am working with the dead, but have never been to the local cemetery, well, in Catholic tradition, there's the thing of spirit roads, that every house has a unique way in which the spirits move back to the house of the living. They are not necessarily the same as these roads, and in some parts of the Mediterranean culture especially, which, let's face it, Catholicism is a Mediterranean cult of the dead dressed in Judeo lore. That's its pragmatism on Roman Catholicism. So we can look at technologies of the dead that are there, of creating restless dead, i.e. saints, that must perform miracles because the only respite they get is by offering prayers at Mass. So we could look at that technology from the outside or from the inside and say that these are performing miracles because they were blessed people. If we look at it in a cemetery, Catholic cemeteries have a large central cross called a crucero in Portuguese that is a kingdom all in itself, because this is the stabilizing force of the cemetery, and it is a memory of the great death of Jesus. But it is also, when you go to a cemetery and you do not have your physical dead buried there, where do you pray for them? You can go to a church, but if you want to leave offerings, it's pretty hard to leave Coca-Cola and a Philly cheesesteak right on the communion altar. So to go and leave an offering at the crucero for your dead, because they're not buried there, the crucero becomes a place of gathering for all spirits. It is the stabilizing force, because we are working through the memory of the resurrection of Jesus and the life eternal in these syncretic ways. I preface my Catholicism with the sense of, I grew up Hispanic Catholic. There's nothing besides Catholicism. It's all Catholic. There's Santo Buddha, there's Santo Ganesha. That's just the way my grandmother thought. And I'm happily celebrating that. So I give implant the seed of remapping your sacredness onto the landscape. We are not just enacting pastoral nostalgia in our apartment buildings by pretending that we are 19th century yeomen worshiping a fertility goddess. No offense to those that find fulfillment in that. But go into the local parks at least, build an establishment with your trees, get a tree guide and look at the trees that are growing around you. When we start having carbon footprints on our sacred plants that are so ridiculous, and we still don't know the native weeds that are growing here or the plants that are growing outside our window, that's something else. So as far as sacred tools and empowerment, let's use, I think it's local, great. Worship local, use local, relic local, something. And also just lineage of when you engage in a tradition that is of the community also helps determine sacredness, and oftentimes in these lists of associations and grimoires and magic lists that are going, if I want to work with an Orisha, and I have a list that is the deities of the Cuban Orisha tradition. If I want to do a lamp for love, and I have all these herbs that could bring love, but I ultimately have to go to the spirit and say, do you want to do it with this recipe the way it is? Because if that spirit says no, what the hell? It's like saying, you know what? You seem like a nice person. I'm going to make you food, and I'm going to do the best lasagna that you've ever had, but you don't eat meat, you don't eat cheese, and you're gluten intolerant. You won't accept the meal. And there's this way of meeting also community in these traditions. Consecrate your shrines for you. So a lot of the rituals, the most pivotal rituals in our lives as priests, are performed for us, and we are very little a part of it. It happens after. They initiate the change, much like they say a pilgrimage starts when you leave the holy place, when you go back home into the world. So when a community consecrates your shrine for you, you're sitting in the other room in Penitencia with a shoe over your head, and you're like, this is the most boring, horrible thing I've ever done in my life. And everybody else is doing the thing behind that white curtain, and the ritual's happening, and they're doing this thing, and they hand you this thing, and you're like, okay, great, this is lovely. You engage in that contract, and it starts. Study starts at that point. So I guess that's another side of it, is what is sacred is not only determined by us sometimes.
Thank you, friends.